Behind the velvet voice and tender ballads lived a man whose cruelty knew no bounds when it came to the woman who loved him most. While Elvis Presley sang about not being cruel, Priscilla Beaulieu-Presley endured 14 years of psychological torture that would break most human spirits. The golden couple that America adored was actually a master-slave relationship built on surveillance, isolation, and systematic emotional abuse. Tonight, we expose the shocking truth about how the king of rock and roll transformed an innocent 14-year-old girl into a prisoner in her own life, using manipulation tactics so sophisticated they would make trained interrogators envious. This is the story Hollywood doesn't want you to hear, the real darkness behind Elvis's marriage to Priscilla, where "Don't be cruel" was just another lie from the man who perfected cruelty as an art form. The story of Elvis and Priscilla's relationship begins not with romance, but with one of the most calculated grooming operations in celebrity history. When 24-year-old Elvis Presley first encountered 14-year-old Priscilla Beaulieu at a party in Bad Nauheim, Germany in 1959, he wasn't simply attracted to a pretty young girl. He was identifying his ideal victim for a lifelong project of psychological control and manipulation. What the world saw as a fairy tale romance was actually a masterclass in predatory behavior. Elvis didn't choose Priscilla despite her youth and vulnerability. He chose her precisely because of these qualities. At 14, Priscilla possessed the perfect combination of intelligence and malleability that would allow Elvis to shape her into his ideal companion while ensuring she could never truly escape his influence. The grooming process began immediately and followed textbook patterns that psychologists would later identify in abusive relationships. Elvis showered Priscilla with attention that felt overwhelming and special to a teenage girl who had never experienced such focused interest from an adult. He made her feel uniquely chosen, repeatedly telling her that she was different from other girls and that their connection was something extraordinary that required secrecy and protection. Most insidiously, Elvis began isolating Priscilla from her normal support systems from their very first meetings. He convinced her that her parents, friends, and school connections couldn't understand their special bond. He created an us-against-the-world mentality that made Priscilla feel that Elvis was the only person who truly knew and appreciated her real self. The psychological manipulation intensified when Elvis convinced Priscilla's parents to allow her to visit Graceland during school breaks. These visits served multiple purposes. They removed Priscilla from her familiar environment, placed her completely under Elvis's control, and allowed him to study her psychological responses to various forms of manipulation and reward. During these early visits, Elvis established patterns that would define their entire relationship. He would alternate between intense attention and complete neglect, creating an addictive cycle where Priscilla constantly sought to regain his approval. When she pleased him, she received overwhelming affection and gifts. When she disappointed him, she faced cold silence and emotional abandonment that left her desperate to understand what she had done wrong. Elvis also began the process of reshaping Priscilla's identity during these formative visits. He criticized her natural appearance, clothing choices, and personal interests, gradually convincing her that her authentic self was inadequate. At the same time, he provided detailed instructions about how she should look, dress, and behave to maintain his interest and approval. The most disturbing aspect of this early grooming was how Elvis used his status and charisma to make his controlling behavior seem like evidence of his deep love and commitment. He convinced Priscilla that his jealousy, surveillance, and restrictions were proof of how much she meant to him. A teenage girl with no experience in adult relationships had no framework for recognizing these as warning signs of abusive behavior. By the time Priscilla moved to Graceland permanently at age 17, Elvis had already succeeded in creating a person who existed primarily to serve his emotional and psychological needs. She had been systematically separated from her own identity, desires, and support systems, leaving her completely dependent on Elvis for validation, direction, and purpose. The tragedy was that Priscilla genuinely believed this was love. Elvis had convinced her that the intensity of his control was actually the intensity of his devotion, and that submitting to his demands was the ultimate expression of her love for him. This psychological foundation would make it nearly impossible for her to recognize or escape the escalating abuse that would define the next decade of her life. When Priscilla permanently moved to Graceland in 1963, she discovered that her fairy tale castle was actually an elaborately decorated prison designed to ensure she could never escape Elvis's total control. What appeared to outsiders as the ultimate luxury lifestyle was revealed to be a sophisticated system of surveillance, isolation, and psychological manipulation that would systematically destroy Priscilla's sense of self and autonomy over the next several years. Physical restrictions were immediately apparent and non-negotiable. Priscilla was forbidden from leaving Graceland without Elvis's explicit permission and was never allowed to go anywhere alone. When she did leave the property, she was accompanied by Elvis's hand-picked associates, who reported back to him about every conversation, interaction, and behavior. These bodyguards weren't protecting Priscilla, they were monitoring her for Elvis. Even more controlling were the rules governing Priscilla's personal appearance and behavior within Graceland itself. Elvis dictated every aspect of her daily routine, from when she woke up to when she went to bed. He chose her clothing, hairstyles, and makeup, creating a living doll that reflected his specific fantasies rather than allowing Priscilla to express her own personality or preferences. The psychological isolation was perhaps even more devastating than the physical restrictions. Elvis systematically eliminated Priscilla's relationships with anyone who might provide alternative perspectives or emotional support. Friends from her past were discouraged from visiting, and new friendships were subject to Elvis's approval and constant monitoring. He created an environment where Priscilla's entire social world consisted of people who were financially and professionally dependent on Elvis's goodwill. Elvis's manipulation of information was particularly sophisticated and cruel. He controlled what newspapers, magazines, and television programs Priscilla was allowed to see, carefully filtering her understanding of the outside world. When stories appeared about his affairs with other women, Elvis would either hide them completely or present them with his own interpretation designed to make Priscilla feel responsible for his infidelity. The daily routine at Graceland was structured to maintain Elvis's absolute dominance while creating the illusion that Priscilla was living a privileged life. She was expected to be available for Elvis's attention at all times, regardless of her own needs or interests. When Elvis wanted company, Priscilla was required to drop everything and focus entirely on entertaining him. When he wanted privacy, she was expected to disappear without question or complaint. Most disturbing was how Elvis used psychological rewards and punishments to maintain control over Priscilla's emotional state. When she pleased him, she received extravagant gifts and overwhelming affection that made her feel like the most important person in the world. But these rewards were unpredictable and temporary, creating an addiction-like dependence on Elvis's approval that made the periods of punishment even more devastating. The punishments were designed to be psychologically rather than physically harmful, though they were no less damaging. Elvis would withdraw his attention completely, treating Priscilla as if she were invisible for days or weeks at a time. He would make cutting remarks about her intelligence, appearance, or worth that left her feeling worthless and desperate to regain his favor. Perhaps most cruelly, Elvis would periodically threaten to end their relationship and send Priscilla away, knowing that by this point she had no independent identity or support system to fall back on. These threats served as ultimate leverage, ensuring that Priscilla would endure any amount of mistreatment rather than face the terror of complete abandonment. The staff at Graceland were trained to reinforce Elvis's control over Priscilla, rather than provide her with any independent support or assistance. They reported her activities and conversations back to Elvis, creating an atmosphere of constant surveillance that made genuine privacy or authentic relationships impossible. By 1967, Priscilla had become exactly what Elvis intended, a beautiful, compliant extension of his own ego who existed solely to serve his needs and validate his power. The vibrant, intelligent teenager who had arrived at Graceland had been systematically destroyed and replaced with a perfectly controlled artifact of Elvis's psychological manipulation. By 1968, Elvis's psychological control over Priscilla had evolved into something approaching systematic torture as his paranoia, drug abuse, and need for absolute dominance reached dangerous new levels. What had begun as manipulation and control transformed into a campaign of psychological warfare designed to completely break down Priscilla's remaining sense of self and independence. The methods Elvis employed during this period would later be recognized by therapists as textbook examples of domestic psychological abuse. Surveillance escalated to levels that bordered on obsessive madness. Elvis installed listening devices throughout Graceland to monitor Priscilla's private conversations, hired private investigators to follow her during her rare permitted outings, and demanded detailed reports from staff members about her activities during every moment they weren't together. He would quiz her about conversations she'd had hours earlier, revealing that nothing she said or did escaped his attention. Elvis's drug abuse during this period amplified his controlling tendencies into something truly frightening. Under the influence of amphetamines and barbiturates, he would subject Priscilla to hours-long interrogations about her loyalty, her thoughts, and her feelings. These sessions often took place in the middle of the night, with Elvis shaking Priscilla awake to demand explanations for perceived slights or suspicious behaviors that existed only in his chemically altered imagination. The psychological games became increasingly sophisticated and cruel. Elvis would plant false information to test Priscilla's reactions, create situations designed to make her jealous or insecure, and deliberately contradict himself to keep her constantly confused about his expectations. He seemed to take genuine pleasure in watching her struggle to understand and please him, knowing that the rules changed constantly and that failure was inevitable. Most devastating was how Elvis began using Priscilla's love for him as a weapon against her. He would threaten suicide when she showed any signs of independence or resistance, knowing that her fear of being responsible for his death would force her into compliance. These threats were accompanied by dramatic displays of self-destructive behavior that convinced Priscilla that Elvis's mental stability depended entirely on her absolute submission. The isolation became so complete that Priscilla began to lose touch with objective reality. Elvis had succeeded in creating a world where his version of events was the only truth that mattered, and where questioning his interpretation of situations was evidence of disloyalty or mental instability. Priscilla found herself doubting her own perceptions and memories, a psychological state that experts now recognize as gaslighting. Elvis's sexual control over Priscilla was equally disturbing and manipulative. He alternated between periods of intense sexual attention and complete sexual rejection, using intimacy as another tool for reward and punishment. He would criticize her sexual responses, compare her unfavorably to other women, and create elaborate rules about when and how they could be intimate that kept Priscilla constantly insecure about this aspect of their relationship. The most chilling aspect of this period was Elvis's apparent belief that his behavior was motivated by love rather than control. He genuinely seemed to believe that his surveillance, manipulation, and psychological abuse were necessary to protect Priscilla and maintain their relationship. This self-deception allowed him to escalate his controlling behavior while maintaining his self-image as a devoted partner. Friends and family members who witnessed Elvis and Priscilla's Interactions during this period later described, feeling deeply uncomfortable about what they observed, but few were willing to intervene. Elvis's power, wealth, and reputation made him seemingly untouchable, while Priscilla's isolation made it nearly impossible for outside support to reach her. The breaking point came when Priscilla began experiencing physical symptoms of psychological trauma, chronic insomnia, panic attacks, and periods of dissociation where she felt disconnected from her own body and emotions. Even Elvis seemed to recognize that his control had pushed Priscilla beyond her psychological limits, though his response was to blame her for being weak, rather than acknowledging his own role in her deterioration. By 1969, Priscilla existed in a state of learned helplessness that made resistance seem impossible and escape seem unthinkable, even as every aspect of her being screamed for freedom from the psychological torture that had become her daily reality. The process of Priscilla's escape from Elvis's psychological prison was neither sudden nor simple. It was a gradual awakening that took years to accomplish and came at a cost that would haunt both of them for the rest of their lives. Her journey toward freedom began in the early 1970s, when a combination of factors finally gave her the strength to recognize that what she had accepted as love was actually sophisticated abuse designed to destroy her as an independent human being. The catalyst for change came through Priscilla's involvement in martial arts training, which Elvis had initially encouraged as a way to keep her occupied and physically fit for his enjoyment. However, the discipline and mental focus required for karate began to restore Priscilla's sense of personal agency and physical confidence. For the first time in over a decade, she was learning skills that belonged to her alone and couldn't be taken away by Elvis's disapproval or manipulation. More importantly, martial arts training introduced Priscilla to Mike Stone, an instructor who treated her with respect and recognized her as an individual rather than an extension of Elvis's ego. Through Stone's eyes, Priscilla began to see herself as someone capable of independent thought and action rather than merely as Elvis's perfectly controlled creation. This relationship provided her with the emotional support necessary to begin questioning the reality Elvis had constructed around her. Affair with Mike Stone was Priscilla's first act of genuine rebellion against Elvis's control, and it served as proof to herself that she could make choices independent of his approval. The secrecy required to maintain the relationship also helped her redevelop skills of independent planning and decision-making that had been systematically destroyed during her years at Graceland. When Elvis discovered the affair, his reaction revealed the true extent of his psychological instability and vindictive nature. Rather than accepting responsibility for the emotional abuse that had driven Priscilla away, Elvis launched a campaign of harassment and intimidation designed to punish her for her betrayal and force her return to his control. Elvis used his extensive network of associates and private investigators to stalk Priscilla and Mike Stone, gathering compromising information and photographs that he threatened to release publicly. He made threatening phone calls to Stone's family members and business associates, using his wealth and influence to damage Stone's career and reputation in the martial arts community. The psychological warfare extended to Priscilla as well. Elvis alternated between desperate pleas for reconciliation and vicious attacks on her character, intelligence, and morality. He spread rumors about her mental stability and sexual behavior, attempting to isolate her from potential support systems by destroying her reputation within their shared social circles. Most disturbing was Elvis's use of their daughter Lisa Marie as a weapon in his psychological warfare against Priscilla. He would cancel planned visits at the last minute to punish Priscilla, make subtle threats about custody arrangements, and attempt to turn Lisa Marie against her mother by portraying Priscilla as the villain who had destroyed their family. Elvis's drug abuse escalated dramatically during this period, as he struggled to cope with the loss of absolute control over another human being. Friends reported that he became increasingly paranoid and violent, convinced that Priscilla's escape was part of a larger conspiracy against him, involving his manager, record company, and various government agencies. The legal divorce proceedings became another battlefield where Elvis attempted to maintain control through financial manipulation and custody threats. He used his superior resources to drag out the process, hoping to exhaust Priscilla's emotional and financial reserves and force her to accept terms that would maintain his dominance over her life. However, Priscilla's newfound strength and determination proved stronger than Elvis's manipulation. She refused to be intimidated by his threats or seduced by his promises of change, recognizing that returning to him would mean accepting a lifetime of psychological imprisonment. The final irony was that Elvis's revenge against Priscilla ultimately destroyed him more thoroughly than it harmed her. His obsession with punishing her for her independence consumed his energy, damaged his remaining relationships, and accelerated his descent into the drug addiction and paranoia that would eventually kill him. Priscilla's escape represented more than just the end of a marriage. It was proof that even the most sophisticated psychological control could be overcome by human resilience and the fundamental desire for freedom and dignity. The truth about Elvis and Priscilla's marriage exposes one of entertainment history's darkest secrets: how America's most beloved performer used his charm and power to systematically destroy the woman who loved him most. Behind the romantic facade lay a masterpiece of psychological manipulation that turned love into a prison and devotion into torture. Priscilla's courage to escape saved her life, but the scars from 14 years of abuse shaped both their destinies forever. Elvis a master manipulator, or just a damaged man who didn't know how to love? Could Priscilla have escaped sooner, or was she truly trapped by his psychological control? Share your thoughts in the comments. Do you think this was abuse, or just a toxic relationship that got out of hand? Smash that like button if this story opened your eyes to the dark side of the king. Subscribe for more shocking celebrity truths, and hit that notification bell. Next week, we're exposing the Hollywood power couple whose perfect marriage hid a murder conspiracy. The evidence will blow your mind.